In the forgotten chambers of ancient covens, a single crimson brew holds the power to shift the balance between witches and vampires. Welcome to today's deep dive into Death Wine, the witch's blood that feeds the vampire king. This forbidden elixir, crafted from sacrifice, spellcraft, and shadow, has shaped centuries of dark alliances and deadly betrayals. In this video, we uncover its origins, its terrifying purpose, and the eerie rituals surrounding its creation. Prepare to learn why Death Wine is feared, coveted, and eternally bound to the Vampire King's throne. Step into the darkness, if you dare. The origin of Death Wine, a curse born from desperation vampire. Death Wine, whispered in forbidden halls, feared among witches, coveted among vampires, and remembered only in the oldest shadows, is no mere potion. It is a legacy of agony, betrayal, sacrifice, and the darkest kind of hope. It is a curse created not through malice, but through desperation. Before it became the sacred sustenance of vampire monarchs and the heart of countless Gothic legends, Death Wine was the result of one woman's desperate attempt to save the world she loved, and the man who destroyed it. To understand the origin of Death Wine, one must journey back to a time before vampires ruled the night, before witches and blood drinkers became intertwined fates, and before the first drop of crimson sorrow spilled into an alchemical chalice. Before the curse, when vampires were mortal. Long before the first vampire tasted immortal thirst, they were a proud but fragile people known as the Noctarii, a tribe of warrior kings and queens, mortals with an uncanny affinity for the night. Their kingdom lay in an eternal twilight valley where the sun rarely pierced the mountains. They worshipped the moon as a goddess and believed that death was the final and honorable resting place of all living things. Their greatest king was Valak Draven, a warrior unmatched in blade or mind. But even greatness carries seeds of ruin. Though loved by his people, Valak feared one thing above all: the fragility of mortality. He had conquered nations, survived battles that should have slain him, and built an empire that rivaled the gods. Yet every wound, every scar, every funeral pyre reminded him he was fading. And as he aged, the shadows around him grew sharper, whispering that power was fleeting. Valak sought immortality not out of arrogance, but from a deep terror of the unknown. He could not bear the thought of watching his kingdom crumble after his death, nor could he bear the idea of losing the one person he cherished above all others: Seraphine, the witch whose love steadied his troubled heart. 2. Seraphine, the witch of dawn and dusk. Seraphine was no ordinary witch. She belonged to an ancient line known as the Velathri, guardians of life's balance. Unlike dark witches who wielded bone magic or blood rituals, the Velathri practiced Lemuria, magic rooted in the harmony of creation and decay. They understood that death was not an enemy, but a necessary counterpart to life. When Seraphine fell in love with Valak, she believed she could guide him toward accepting mortality with grace. But as the years passed and his desperation grew, so too did the distance between them. Valak pleaded with her for immortality, but Seraphine refused. The Velathri were sworn never to meddle with the natural cycle of life. To break that oath meant unleashing consequences beyond comprehension. Valak's desperation turned to obsession. He began consulting forbidden scholars, dark alchemists, and shadow priests. Rumors spread of gruesome experiments, twisted rituals, and the disappearance of entire villages whose blood was drained for macabre research. Seraphine confronted him, horrified, but Valak insisted he did it for them, for their love, for their kingdom, and for their future. The witch and the king, once bound by devotion, became divided by fear. 3. The cataclysm of the Crimson Eclipse. All legends have a breaking point. For Valak, it came during the Crimson Eclipse, a rare celestial event when the sun vanished and the moon bled red across the heavens. On that night, Valak enacted his grandest ritual, the Rite of Eternal Dominion, a spell meant to tear mortality from his body and replace it with everlasting life. Seraphine sensed the disturbance in the fabric of life magic and arrived at the ritual's heart, Valak's great obsidian altar. Too late. Blood lay in rivers. The corpses of his advisors drained of essence. surrounded the king like macabre offerings. Valak stood at the center, triumphant, transformed by a new power. His heart no longer beat. His skin gleamed pale as silver. His eyes glowed with a predatory crimson. He had succeeded, but at a price he did not yet understand. The spell was incomplete, because Seraphine had bound a protective ward around Valak years earlier. The ritual deviated. Instead of granting him divine immortality, it cursed him with vampirism, a twisted form of eternal life fueled by bloodlust, hunger, and endless longing. When Valak saw Seraphine, he begged her forgiveness. But she saw what he could not. The curse would spread, infecting anyone he touched. His people would suffer. His kingdom would fall. She made a choice that shattered her soul. She cast the Severance of Tethers, a forbidden Valathri spell that broke their bond, and attempted to end Valak's cursed life. But the spell backfired. His newfound immortality made him immune to death magic. Instead, Seraphine's power rebounded onto herself, shredding her life force and for Seraphine's desperation and the birth of the curse. Seraphine lived, but she was dying. The rebounded curse ensured her blood now carried the same vampiric taint as Valak's, but in a volatile, unstable form. Her veins burned, her magic ruptured, her body trembled between life and death. Knowing she had days at most, Seraphine sought a way to stop Valak's curse from spreading. If he remained as he was, the Noctarii people would fall one by one, transformed into monsters driven by hunger. She needed a solution, a cure, a weapon, or something entirely new. In a secret chamber beneath the ancient Valathri sanctuary, Seraphine began crafting her final spell. She mixed sacred moon water with her own cursed blood, combined with phoenix ash, wolfsbane, shadowthorn petals, and the last breath of a dying star trapped in a crystal phial. She worked relentlessly, despite the pain consuming her body. Each drop of blood she bled into the cauldron felt like burning molten iron. Each incantation rattled her bones. What she created was not a cure, nor was it a weapon. It was something far more strange. Her blood, infused with the remains of her dying magic, transformed into a shimmering, swirling elixir, black as night, red as death, and warm as living flesh. It pulsed with her heartbeat. She named it Death Wine, the blood of the witch, the curse of love, the wine of perdition. Seraphine believed Death Wine could do one thing: bind the curse within Valak, preventing it from spreading to others. It would not destroy his vampirism, nor restore his mortality, but it would control the hunger, anchor the curse, and prevent his monstrous nature from consuming the world. She knew the cost. Death Wine required the living blood of its creator. The creator had to remain alive so the curse binding would last. And Seraphine was already dying. She had one final choice: the witch's final sacrifice. Seraphine returned to confront Valak, carrying the chalice of Death Wine. He wept at the sight of her. She was pale, fragile, her once radiant magic now flickering like a dying lantern. He tried to embrace her, but she stopped him. Even a touch from him could further corrupt her already shattered form. She explained what she had done. Valak refused to drink it. He could not bear the thought of imprisoning himself in a curse of her making, especially if it came from her suffering. Then Seraphine revealed the truth. If he did not drink it, his curse would soon spread beyond control. He would doom the world. And worse, Seraphine's own corrupted blood would transform her into the first true monster of the night, a vampire witch hybrid with no mind or soul. To save the world and to save her, he had to drink. With trembling hands, Valak took the chalice. The liquid shimmered with her life, her pain, her love. He drank it all. Immediately, the death wine bound itself to him. His hunger calmed. His curse stabilized. His raging blood quieted. But Seraphine collapsed, her life force nearly drained. Valak held her, knowing her time was nearly gone. In her final breath, she whispered, "You will live forever. Remember me in every drop." And then she died. 6. Death Wine after Seraphine's death. When Seraphine's heart stopped, the world trembled. The Valathri line vanished. Their sanctuary crumbled. The balance of life and death tilted forever. Valak, now the first vampire king, mourned for centuries. But the death wine continued binding his curse, until he discovered its deeper truth. Death wine required renewal. Every generation, the blood of a witch descended from Seraphine's distant bloodlines, or a witch with similar life-binding magic, had to be offered to refresh the elixir. Without this renewal, the curse would unravel, returning Valak to uncontrollable hunger and risking a global epidemic of vampirism. Thus began the tragedy passed through ages. Witches would be hunted. Their blood would be harvested. Their lives offered to sustain death wine. And vampires would rise as rulers of the night. But not all vampires followed Valak's intentions. Some abused death wine. Some corrupted it. Some weaponized it. Death wine became everything. A sacred relic, a forbidden substance, a symbol of power, and a reminder of a love more painful than death. 7. The curse born from desperation. In the end, death wine was not born of evil. It was born of desperation. A witch's desperation to save the world, and a king's desperation to escape death. It was a curse forged from love, fear, sacrifice, and hope twisted into something dark and immortal. Seraphine's final act created the very substance that would forever bind vampires and witches in a cycle of dependency, conflict, and sorrow. Her legacy lived not through her descendants, but through the dark wine that carried her essence. Death wine is therefore more than an elixir, more than a curse, more than a myth. It is the last heartbeat of a dying witch captured in a chalice, carried through eternity by the king who loved and doomed her. And so the legend endures. Where vampires reign, death wine flows. Where witches wander, the shadows whisper Seraphine's name. And where the night deepens, the curse continues. Born from desperation, sustained by blood, and forever haunting the immortal throne it created. Why the vampire king needs death wine. The legends of the vampire kingdoms are filled with forbidden rites, ancient bargains, and mystical sustenance beyond mortal comprehension. Yet among all vampiric relics and rituals, coffins carved from moonfall stone, crowns etched from bone, curses sealed with starless ink, none carry as much reverence or terror as death wine, the blood-distilled elixir created from the sacrifice, power, and essence of a witch. For the vampire king, a ruler bound to both immortality and insatiable thirst, death wine is not a luxury. It is a necessity, one tied to his survival, dominance, and the ancient treaties that hold the night in balance. To understand why the vampire king needs death wine, one must plunge into the origins of the elixir, the nature of vampiric evolution, the arcane metabolism of royal bloodlines, and the cosmic curse that binds the vampire king to a cycle of power and decay. Only by confronting the forbidden history buried beneath centuries of shadows can one grasp why this crimson, enchanted substance is the only thing keeping the vampire king from collapsing into oblivion or unleashing a catastrophe upon the mortal world. The curse of the first crown. Why royal vampires decay. While all vampires drink blood, the royal lineage is governed by a far darker truth. The vampire king bears the curse of the first crown, an ancient condition created in the moment the first vampire monarch seized the throne of dusk. According to myth, the first vampire king, Arcanos the Blackened, stole the throne not by inheritance, but by slaying a celestial being, an act that gave him immense power, but cost him his natural immortality. Royal vampires do not simply live forever. They rot slowly, painfully, inevitably. Their bodies, though strong and eternal, wage a constant war against a spiritual corrosion called the hollowing, a withering of the soul that begins the moment they assume the mantle of kingship. Ordinary blood slows this corrosion but cannot stop it. Even the blood of magical creatures, powerful as it is, only delays the inevitable. The vampire king requires a substance potent enough to counteract celestial decay, a liquid dense with spiritual energy strong enough to patch the holes in his unraveling soul. Only one thing in the world contains such power: witch blood. But even witch blood alone is insufficient. It must be alchemized, transformed, and awakened into its highest form, death wine. 2. Witch blood and the roots of forbidden alchemy. Witches have always been beings of duality, mortal bodies housing supernatural magic. Their blood is infused with raw arcane essence, shaped by the lunar cycles, ancestral pacts, and elemental forces. Unlike vampiric blood, which sustains physical immortality, witch blood sustains magical continuity, a connection to forces older than gods. To a vampire, witch blood is both intoxicating and lethal. Drunk raw, it can set a vampire's veins aflame, overload their undead flesh with magic, induce madness, visions, or uncontrollable power surges, shatter the boundaries between the mortal and spiritual world. But refined into death wine, witch blood becomes stable, containable, even consumable. Death wine is created through a process that requires both alchemy and sacrificial magic. The witch must willingly or unwillingly offer part of her essence, which is then mixed with lunar salts, nightshade marrow, and the ashes of a vampire elder. The concoction is fermented under perpetual darkness for 13 nights until it transforms into a glowing crimson-black liquid. This is not merely blood. It is pure distilled magic. And for the Vampire King, it is the only remedy to the hollowing. 3. The Throne's Hunger. How kingship consumes the soul. What ordinary vampires fear, the Vampire King experiences 1,000-fold. The throne itself is a living artifact, forged from the bones of fallen gods during the First War between witches and vampires. It is a source of unimaginable power, but that power demands payment. Every night the Vampire King sits upon the throne of dusk. His soul is partially devoured. Every command he issues drains his life force. Every use of royal magic fractures his essence further. The throne feeds on his memories, his vitality, his sense of self, and without death wine, the throne would eventually consume him entirely. Thus, the Vampire King must drink death wine not for pleasure, but for survival. It rebinds his soul to his body, seals the cracks in his essence, and replenishes what the throne eats. In essence, death wine is the price of ruling the night. Without it, even the greatest Vampire King would crumble into dust. 4. Death wine as a weaponized elixir. Beyond sustaining the king's life, death wine amplifies his powers in ways unmatched by any other substance. Each sip grants him access to both vampiric and witch-born abilities. These hybridized powers make him the most formidable being in the realms of night. By drinking death wine, the Vampire King gains 1. Witch sight. He can perceive souls, curses, hidden spells, threads of fate, unseen dimensions. This sight allows him to detect betrayals, foresee witch rebellions, and uncover ancient secrets. 2. Blood dominion. Death wine enhances his control over blood magic, enabling him to command lesser vampires through their veins, bend undead bodies to his will, create blood storms capable of dissolving armies. This power is the source of the Vampire King's legendary battlefield dominance. 3. Day stalking. For a brief period after drinking death wine, the king gains limited resistance to sunlight. He cannot walk freely under full day, but the early dawn and late dusk no longer burn him. This advantage makes him terrifyingly unpredictable. 4. Soul weaving. This is the rarest and most dangerous gift. The king can reach into another being's soul, twist it, bind it, or consume it. This power is heavily restricted by ancient treaties, but death wine makes it possible. These abilities are not natural. They are borrowed from the witch whose essence created the death wine. Thus, every bottle of death wine is also a vessel of stolen magic, an act of dominance. By V. The political necessity. How death wine keeps the kingdom from falling. The Vampire King does not exist in isolation. His survival is the linchpin keeping the Vampire Kingdom intact. If he weakens, the entire hierarchy collapses. Here's why. 1. He maintains the blood oath network. The king's power flows down through the royal bloodline. Every vampire, noble, servant, warrior, or nightborn is spiritually connected to him. If he dies, their powers destabilize, their hungers intensify, their minds fracture. Civil war ignites instantly. Thus, the king must remain strong for the kingdom to remain sane. 2. He upholds the Treaty of Midnight, a pact made eons ago between witches, vampires, and shapeshifters. Only a fully empowered vampire king can enforce it. If he weakens, the treaty dissolves and the world plunges into chaos. 3. He commands the night legions. The undead armies respond only to the king's voice. Without his Deathwine-fueled presence, they would run wild or fall asleep for centuries, leaving the kingdom vulnerable. Deathwine is not merely a personal addiction. It is the foundation of vampire civilization. 6. The moral paradox. Why the vampire king hates his own survival. One of the darkest tragedies of the vampire king's existence is that he despises the very thing he relies on. Because Deathwine is made from witches. Every drop represents a life stolen, a soul scarred, a power ripped from its rightful owner. Many kings justify this by claiming witches once enslaved vampires, or that witches themselves forged the curse of royal decay. But morality, however twisted, does not ease the guilt of survival. Royal vampires are not emotionless monsters. They are cursed, burdened, aware of the cost of their existence. The vampire king knows. Every bottle of Deathwine is a grave. Every sip is a theft. Every replenished ounce of power is paid for with suffering. Thus, he drinks not with joy, but with necessity. His tragedy is simple. To save his kingdom, he must sacrifice those who despise him most. 7. The witch's role, willing, unwilling, or doomed. Though many witches fear or hate vampires, some choose willingly to offer their blood, usually for political power, magical pacts, or immortality. These witches, called Crimson Brides, bind themselves to the king in exchange for elevated status and protection. Others become captives, unwilling donors harvested through forbidden rituals. Still others are bred, raised, or trained specifically for Deathwine alchemy, an abomination criticized even by vampires themselves. The method of acquisition impacts the potency of the Deathwine. Willing blood is the strongest. Unwilling blood is volatile. Corrupted blood can become poison. Thus, the vampire king must tread carefully. One tainted batch can weaken him enough to spark rebellion. 8. The evolution of the addiction. What begins as necessity often ends as dependency. The more a vampire king drinks Deathwine, the more he yearns for it, not physically, but cosmically. His soul becomes accustomed to witch magic, craving it like a second heartbeat. Over centuries, the king builds tolerance, requires more frequent doses, risks losing his identity, fears starvation of the soul. Too much Deathwine can unbalance him. Too little can kill him. The perfect equilibrium is fragile, dangerous, and always shifting. This is why the vampire king's existence is not one of luxury, but of constant fear. 9. The catastrophe if the king goes without Deathwine. If Deathwine disappears, either through witch rebellion, alchemical collapse, or political sabotage, the consequences are catastrophic. 1. The king begins to hollow. His soul tears, his power leaks, and his body cracks like stone under pressure. 2. The kingdom descends into madness. Vampires connected to him feel his decay, becoming feral, starving, uncontrollable. 3. The throne consumes him alive. The throne of dusk, sensing weakness, devours the failing king's essence entirely. 4. The night shatters. The borders between the mortal realm, the spirit world, and the void collapse, allowing horrors long sealed away to reawaken. Thus, Deathwine is not merely important. It is the very linchpin holding reality together. X. The final truth. Deathwine is the price of immortality. In the end, the vampire king needs Deathwine because he is trapped in a paradox. He is immortal, yet constantly dying. He is powerful, yet consumed by the throne he rules. He is feared, yet dependent on the blood of his greatest enemies. He is king, yet enslaved to the curse of kingship. Deathwine is the chain that binds him to existence, the red thread stitching his soul together, the elixir keeping the night from collapsing into chaos. Without it, the vampire king is nothing. With it, he is everything. and yet eternally damned. Thus, the answer to why the Vampire King needs death wine is hauntingly simple. Because immortality is not free. Because power always demands blood. Because kingship requires sacrifice. Because the night must be fed. And death wine, witch's blood transformed into alchemical divinity, is the only thing potent enough to pay that price. The witch who tried to end death wine vampire. A word whispered in trembling all throughout the shadowed kingdoms of the vampire world. It is the crimson elixir forged from the blood of witches, concentrated, alchemically transmuted, and aged in spellbound chalices. To vampires, death wine is both sacrament and sin, a drink that magnifies their power 100-fold, granting them foresight, night strength, and centuries of sustained life. Yet it demands a terrible price. Every drop requires a witch's death. For 1,000 years, the death wine vampire kings ruled through this horrific ritual. They were not merely sustained by witch blood, they were addicted to it, dependent upon a cycle of slaughter that perpetuated their dominance. Witch clans hid in forests, mountains, and spectral realms, struggling to survive. Their lives were measured not in years, but in how long they could remain unseen. But the cycle of predation and fear did not remain unchallenged. From the embers of massacre and despair arose a single figure, a witch whose fury shaped legend, whose grief carved destiny. Her name would become both a promise and a threat. She was known as Lunara Thorn, the witch who tried to end Deathwine Vampire. This is her story. The birth of a witch in a bleeding age. Lunara Thorn was born during the blood eclipse, a celestial event that cast the skies into deep scarlet for 7 days. Witch seers read the omen with dread. A child born under such a sky would carry a destiny intertwined with death, blood, and the unending struggle between witches and vampires. That same night, the Deathwine King, Varric the Undying, commanded a purge across the borderlands. Dozens of witches were harvested to replenish his chalices. Lunara's mother, Saristia, fled with her newborn into the Thornwild Forest, but she was tracked. The vampire hunters found them at dawn. Saristia sacrificed herself to save her child, shattering her soul into a protective ward that concealed Lunara and cloaked her in invisibility. When the hunters turned away, believing the child perished, Lunara's fate was sealed. Her first breath was taken amidst death. Her first lullaby was a mother's scream. She was rescued by the Mararut Coven, a nomadic circle of witches who vowed to safeguard those orphaned by the Deathwine Purge. They raised her in secret, training her in all the arts of witchcraft, herbal sorcery, shadow weaving, astral defense, and the forbidden craft of soul binding. From childhood, Lunara displayed a rare talent. Her magic was not merely strong, it was adaptive, reactive, tied to emotion in ways unseen among witches for centuries. Anger shaped her fire, grief shaped her shadows, hope shaped her healing. Elders speculated that the blood eclipse had granted her a form of magic born from raw essence rather than ritual structure. But with that gift came danger. The Deathwine King always sensed anomalies in the arcane weave, disturbances that hinted at witches powerful enough to threaten his supremacy. As Lunara matured, Varric began to dream of a witch wrapped in starlight and shadow, a witch destined to undo his reign. He began to hunt her long before he knew her name. 2. The truth behind Deathwine. Most witches understood Deathwine only as horror, an execution sentence disguised as a drink. But Lunara thirsted for understanding. Why did the ritual exist? How had it begun? Could it be unmade? Her search for answers took her into ancient ruins, forbidden archives, and spectral caverns guarded by the dead. Piece by piece, she uncovered the truth. Deathwine was never meant to be a vampire ritual. It had been created by witches. Centuries earlier, during the era of the First Night War, a powerful witch named Alindra Moongrave sought to end vampire kind by crafting a weapon, a blood-based potion that would destabilize the vampire soul force. But her formula was stolen, corrupted, and reversed by the first Deathwine Vampire King. Instead of destroying vampires, it bound them more tightly to life. Worse, which blood was now permanently tied to the survival of the Deathwine lineage. A terrible revelation struck Lenara. If Deathwine continued, witches would eventually go extinct. If witches disappeared, the vampires would also perish. Both species were locked in a cycle of mutual destruction. This knowledge became Lenara's turning point. She realized ending Deathwine was not vengeance, it was survival. 3. The Forbidden Plan. To destroy Deathwine, Lenara needed to unravel the ritual at its source. But such an act required confronting the Deathwine King himself. The ritual's power was anchored in his blood, his throne, and the centuries of which souls bound to his existence. For tasks had to be completed. Break the chalice bond. The chalices used to brew Deathwine were forged from the bones of ancient witches. Lenara needed to locate and shatter them. Sever the bloodline thread. The Deathwine King's lineage was magically tethered to the ritual. She needed to detach his soul from the siphon. Unbind the witch spirits. The souls trapped within the Deathwine reservoirs had to be freed. Confront and defeat the Vampire King. Without destroying him, the ritual would reform within another heir. This mission was considered impossible. Elders forbade it. Allies warned her. Even spirits whispered that her fate would be death. Lenara replied only, "Then let my death end 1,000 more." Thus, she became the renegade witch, the one who defied her coven and walked into shadow. 4. The Journey into the Deathwine Kingdom. The Vampire Kingdom lay beyond the mountains of eternal dusk, beneath a sky that never brightened. Lenara crossed into the realm disguised in moon-woven glamour. She witnessed horrors. Witches drained in silver cages, blood channels carved into stone, chalices glowing with trapped souls. Yet she also saw something unexpected. Not all vampires supported the ritual. Some were born into the Deathwine dynasty against their will, cursed to depend on the drink. Those who resisted grew weak, withered, or died. The Deathwine King enforced the ritual with absolute tyranny. Lenara forged secret alliances with dissident vampires, Shadow Court nobles, scholars, and bloodless rebels who had grown sick of the king's gluttony. In their ranks was Prince Ahriman, Varric's own son, who despised his father's cruelty. Together, they formed the Unblooded Oath, a clandestine rebellion. Ahriman taught Lenara the inner workings of the palace, the chalice vaults, the ghost-forged chambers, and the throne hall where the Deathwine ritual was renewed every lunar cycle. In return, Lenara offered a sliver of hope, a future where vampires no longer depended on witch blood. It was a monstrous gamble. If she succeeded, she would be hailed as savior. If she failed, the vampires would be thrown into magical starvation, unleashing chaos across the realm. Still, she pressed forward. Breaking the first chalice. Deep within the palace catacombs lay the first chalice, the original vessel forged from Elindra Mungrave's bones. Its destruction was the first step to unmaking the ritual. The chalice was guarded by spectral sentinels, witch spirits enslaved by the king. Lenara approached them with reverence. Instead of using force, she sang an ancient lullaby her mother once whispered among trees. The song carried soul-binding resonance. The spirits responded, recognizing kinship. They parted, allowing her through. She touched the chalice, whispering a release spell. Cracks spread like starfire. A pulse of magic thundered through the realm. The first chain of Deathwine snapped. The king felt it instantly. His scream shook the sky. 6. The King's Wrath. Varric unleashed terror across the kingdom. Hunters stormed the cities, dragging witches from hiding. Vampires loyal to him tore through rebel enclaves. The sky bled red as the Deathwine reserves reacted violently to the chalice's destruction. Lenara became the most hunted being in the realm. But she did not falter. With Ahriman and the rebels, she moved swiftly to the second objective. 7. Severing the bloodline thread. Within the throne room stood the Bloodroot Tree, a monstrous structure of bone and vein, grown from the first Deathwine King's heart. It connected every ruler to the ritual. Lenara climbed the tree under cover of shadow, weaving spells of silence as she ascended. At its peak, she found the bloodline thread, a shimmering cord pulsing with life. She drew a dagger made from her mother's soul ward and sliced it. The tree screamed. The ritual faltered. The king staggered, weakened, but not yet defeated. 8. Freeing the trapped witch souls. The final reservoirs of death wine glowed like molten crimson moons. Within them swirled the spirits of 1,000 murdered witches. Their sorrow was palpable, their torment unending. Lunara placed her hands upon the glass. Her magic resonated, calling to the souls within. One by one, they awakened, recognizing her as the child of grief, the daughter of sacrifice, the witch of the blood eclipse. She invoked the ancient rite of soul unbinding, the spell no witch had dared attempt for centuries. Light burst from the reservoirs as spirits burst free, rising like a storm of stars. The death wine ritual collapsed. The king's power shattered. 9. The final confrontation. Varrock confronted Lunara in the throne hall, weakened but still monstrous. His body crackled with collapsing magic, veins bursting with uncontrolled death wine. "Child of witches," he growled, "you have doomed us all." "No," Lunara answered, "I have freed us all." They clashed, witchcraft against centuries of corrupted power. Shadows collided with flame. Blood magic tore through stone pillars. The hall became a battlefield of light and darkness. At the height of the battle, Varrock lunged to drain her, to replenish his power. Lunara did not resist. She allowed him to drink a single drop of her blood, blood infused with unbinding magic. The moment it touched him, the curse unraveled inside his body. Varrock disintegrated into ash. The Deathwine vampire lineage ended. X. The aftermath. The kingdom trembled. Without Deathwine, vampires weakened, but they did not die. The dissident factions rose to rebuild a society free from the blood curse. Prince Ahriman became the first ruler of the unblooded court, forging peace with witches. Lunara, however, did not remain. She disappeared into the Thornwild Forest, the place where her mother died, where her journey began. Some say she became a guardian spirit. Others believe she walked into the spectral realm, joining the freed souls she rescued. But one thing remains certain. She ended Deathwine. She ended slaughter. She ended the reign of fear. And she proved that a single witch born beneath a blood-red sky could change the destiny of two species. Epilogue. The legend lives. Centuries later, her name is still spoken, not in fear, in gratitude, in reverence, in hope. The witch who tried to end Deathwine Vampire did more than try. She succeeded, and her legend endures as a reminder that even in a world drowned in blood and darkness, one witch's courage can ignite the dawn. And that concludes our journey into the chilling lore of Deathwine, the witch's blood that feeds the Vampire King. If you enjoyed uncovering the secrets behind this dark elixir, its origins, its power, and its deadly legacy, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with fellow lovers of supernatural mysteries. Tell us in the comments, would you dare brew Deathwine or drink it? Your thoughts help shape future explorations into the shadows. Thanks for watching. And until next time, keep your candles lit, your ward strong, and your curiosity alive. The night is always listening.